back to the podcast. Happy to welcome back today's guest, Stephen Hayes. He's the editor and CEO of The Dispatch, one of my favorite sites and podcasts. Steve Hayes, welcome back.
Hey, Matt. Good to be with you.
Great to talk with you. Always crazy times. And we should probably start with a story I don't know much about, but it sounds dicey. Israel is preparing for an attack from Iran. At least that's what the Drudge Report tells me. What in the world is going on?
Yeah, it's a nerve-wracking time. There are reports that Iran wants to avenge the strikes that Israel presumably conducted in Damascus, Syria on April 1st, taking out a high-ranking Iran Revolutionary Guards Corps general, somebody who was helped responsible for managing the relationship between the Iranian regime and Hezbollah. This person had responsibility for Syria and Lebanon and was involved, U.S. intelligence experts think, and Israeli intelligence experts think, in a good bit of terrorism that has affected Israel. So the Israelis took him out in a home near diplomatic facilities in Damascus on April 1st, and Iran has been saying ever since that they would be responding with some level of seriousness for the past week, and it appears that those attacks are imminent. There are all sorts of reports in the U.S. press, the Israeli press, the global press, the regional press, that this is coming. So that accounts for what we're hearing, and there's all sorts of diplomatic back and forth between the U.S. and Israel, between the U.S. and Iran, if you can believe it, and others in the region, I think, trying to sort of calm the situation down, but also be prepared for what most people think is this imminent attack.
Do we have any sense, and I'm guessing they don't want to telegraph too much, but would this be like a conventional attack? Would this be terrorism? Do you have any sense on what we might be expecting?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we can say definitively. There have been reports that this could well be a conventional attack from Iran, from Iranian territory, directly. Israel has made clear that it would respond in kind, and I think rather quickly, if that were the case. What's really interesting is some of the back and forth between the Biden administration and Israel on this. From my perspective, the Biden administration was very strong in its rhetorical support for Israel in the days following the October 7th attacks by Hamas, the worst attacks on Israel since the Holocaust, but has sort of gradually, and I think unfortunately for domestic political reasons, backed off of that support. There are substantive reasons too. I mean, I think Israel can rightly be criticized for going too far in some areas, partially on humanitarian grounds. But what the Biden administration has done is, I think, kept up a steady drumbeat of criticism of our strongest ally in the region at a time when that ally is fighting for its existence. And it has done so, I think, often neglecting the role that Hamas and Islamic extremists in the region played both in this initial conflict, starting this conflict, and also historically as it relates to Israel. But really, to me, the area where the Biden administration has been the weakest is with respect to Iran. We've had Joe Biden and the Biden administration wanting to resurrect the Iran nuclear deal since the campaign, and freeing up Iranian money that everybody acknowledges can be used to support terror. That's what the Iranian regime has done. And I think the Biden administration has been very soft on challenging Iran and holding Iran to account for its role in supporting these Islamic extremist groups in the region, and in what it's been doing to not just the Israelis, but to Americans in the region.
Yeah, I mean, Biden also has gotten some criticism for not being as supportive of Ukraine, even though he has been supportive of Ukraine, not as supportive as he might have been. And I think the reason he was afraid of escalation, which is understandable. I'm wondering, in this case, the imminent possible attack from Iran on Israel, the danger of possible escalation that the U.S. could get dragged into something bigger. And also Joe Biden's domestic political life. I mean, right now he's already in a very, very tough reelection. How might this impact? And I know it's very early, and hopefully nothing will happen. But love to get your thoughts on either of those things.
Yeah, I mean, let me just preface my comments by saying we should be very clear. These are difficult things, right? This isn't easy. There's not an obvious answer. I think people can sometimes be too strident about these things and say, "Oh, there's an obvious choice here. There's an obvious choice there." So, stipulating that this is difficult and that smart people and people of good faith can see this differently. What concerns me about the Biden administration is it seems that, with respect to, I would say, both the conflict in Israel and Ukraine, it seems as if the end goal of Biden administration policies is to avoid escalation. So it's not to help an ally win the war. It's not to send a message to either Russia or Hamas or Iran that our allies shouldn't be messed with, that we can't be messed with. It seems as if the understandable and necessary policy of concern or the concerns about escalation have become the focal point of the policy, and that's backwards to me. We should be sending a strong message to Iran right now that any overt attacks on Israel will be taken very seriously by the United States. But we're not even doing that with respect to Iran-backed attacks on U.S. ships in the region. Senator Dan Sullivan from Alaska, grilled a member of the administration earlier this week on exactly that. And Sullivan asked the question: if Iran is enabling these attacks on U.S. interests, U.S. ships in the region, shouldn't those ships be effectively taken out? I mean, shouldn't the people who are doing this effectively be taken out? I think it's a fair question. And, I think while the concerns about escalation are understandable, you can't be so scared of escalation that it keeps you from implementing the policies necessary to keep Americans safe and to support our allies.
All right. I wanted to talk about that because it's obviously a big, important topic. You know way more about it than I do. We should maybe move on just because it's a developing story and do some rank punditry. I'd love to hear
for it.
Where are we? This 2024 Biden versus Trump race. If you had to, maybe make your bets today, how's it shaking out?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'm about as happy with the choice as you are, as probably many of your listeners are. I think just the fact that we're looking at these two septuagenarian, octogenarian candidates, both of whom I think have real, sort of serious flaws, suggests something about the state of our politics, and it's nothing good. So I think it's a bad moment. Look, I don't think Joe Biden's been a good president. I think he's been, especially from somebody who's a limited government conservative, sort of libertarian on economic policy, some domestic policy, and sort of strong national security hawk. I think Biden has been a bad president. It's been a really crummy president. So there's no enthusiasm for me in supporting Joe Biden. I don't think he's earned a second term. And I think if he were running against anybody other than Donald Trump on the Republican side, he would be in much bigger trouble than he appears to be right now. There's no circumstances under which I would ever support Donald Trump. I think he's been a disaster. I think he presents a unique threat to the American experiment. And I think it would be really bad if he's elected president, if he's returned to the White House. It looks like a tie right now, right? I mean, Donald Trump is leading in many of these 7 swing states. The election's going to be decided in those states in all likelihood. He's been polling well in those states for the past 6 to 8 weeks. But Joe Biden is sort of gradually caught up with him, both in national polling and in some of the swing state polling. So it looks effectively like a tie, with a huge chunk of the American electorate saying, how in the world did we end up with this choice?
So earlier this week, Donald Trump gave this abortion statement, basically saying we'll send it back to the states, which was going to happen anyway. That's what happens when you overturn Roe versus Wade. Immediately, Arizona says, hold my beer. And turns out now the Arizona Supreme Court has reverted back to a 1864 law that essentially bans all abortion except in the case of the life of the mother. So things have gotten really interesting, really weird, really scrambled. Have you seen yet this Carrie Lake video
I
where she
have.
talks
It's
about
the
her
6-minute video. Yes.
position? All right, I'm going to play just a snippet of it and get your response on the other end.
Such a personal and private issue. I chose life, but I'm not every woman. I want to make sure that every woman who finds herself pregnant has more choices so that she can make that choice that I made. I'll never forget the first time I got pregnant, taking that pregnancy test, looking down, and I was excited, but I'll be honest, I was afraid as well. I was nervous. I was anxious. It's natural for women to be nervous and anxious when they're pregnant. I never would ever assume that any woman had the same exact feelings I had or situation I had. We know that some women are economically in a horrible situation. They might be in an abusive relationship. They might be the victim of rape.
So anyway, it's first of all a kinder, gentler Carrie Lake, and it's impossible to really parse exactly what she's saying. But to me, it sounds like that's a pro-choice message. She's saying choose
Yes.
life, like she's George Michael in Wham or something. Choose life, but it's your choice, basically. People, and that was my interpretation. But I wanted to hear, am I misreading that or mishearing that?
No. I mean, I think that's not only the effective message that comes through. I think that's the intended message. I don't think you make that argument sort of by mistake, especially over 5 or 6 minutes. Look, if you think what we've seen, particularly in the aftermath of Donald Trump's video message earlier this week, is people like Kari Lake following Donald Trump's lead. I mean, she made several references to Donald Trump and his leadership and his rhetoric on this issue, making clear that she was following in his footsteps, making pro-choice arguments. And that's what Donald Trump is doing.
Yeah. He wasn't, and by the way, that Donald Trump video where the big message is states' rights, right? But he does say in that video at a certain point, he's like, so do what you want for your family, do what's best for you. Do whatever you want. It's sort of a pro-choice message too.
For sure. And look, this is somebody in Donald Trump who said in 1999 appearance on Meet the Press, I'm very pro-choice. I would love to be pro-life, but I'm very pro-choice. That's the way he described himself. And, by all accounts, that's what he believed up to and through the 2016 Republican primary, when it became expedient or maybe necessary for him to change his tune on that. And once he was the presumptive Republican nominee, he, in typical Donald Trump fashion, made a series of transactional deals with pro-life leaders and pro-life groups. I think some of this was explicit. I think there were conversations that said, like, hey, you support me here and I'll do these following things. And some of it was implied, but that's what happened. And, I think for a while, the pro-lifers who made those deals or supported those deals could say and would say, look, this has been all to the good. Donald Trump appointed 3 pro-life conservative Supreme Court justices, just as he promised that he would do. He in effect outsourced a lot of his judicial picks beyond the court to the Federalist Society and other movement conservatives, real conservatives who believe things. And as a result, the pro-life movement is far ahead of where it would have been in the absence of a Trump presidency. I think they could fairly make that case. Now, I mean, somebody on our staff the other day said, the devil always comes back, right? Now there's the payback. And it seems like this is it. I mean, Trump, after the 2022 midterms, when Republicans lost ground, after widespread expectations that they would do well, Trump blamed it on pro-lifers. He said, this is all about abortion. This is all about pro-life. In the aftermath of Dobbs, he said people didn't make the argument well, and it's all about abortion. Therefore, we shouldn't be as pro-life as we'd been, in effect. Now, I think that the record would show it has probably more to do with Donald Trump and his influence on certain candidates, candidate selection, on the willingness of those candidates to make sort of election denialist, election truther arguments long since disproven. It makes them unpalatable to a broader electorate. But probably the truth is both, right? Abortion and Donald Trump. So what you have now is Donald Trump, in effect, almost disowning the things that he had said and done, and Kari Lake following suit. I mean, the abortion law that you mentioned, she had been a strong supporter of that abortion law as late as I think it was November of 2023. And here she is suggesting, that's way too harsh, can't possibly stand. And oh, by the way, I'm now pro-choice. That makes people awfully cynical.
No, you're right. She was explicitly in favor of returning to that 1864 law, and now is completely flip-flop. You made a point on the Dispatch podcast very recently that Trump makes it harder for principled conservatives. It's not just the life issue. It's a whole bunch of issues. But I'm wondering if you could expound on that a little bit here in case folks haven't heard the Dispatch.
Wait, there are people who don't listen to the Dispatch podcast? I don't know.
I don't
know any of them. I don't know any of them. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, Matt, you and I have talked about this off podcast, I think, a couple times when we've gotten together. And, this is one of the trade-offs with Donald Trump. And I think it's a real negative for movement conservatives, people who believe things, right? Believe in limited government. It's often the case that Trump will take an argument where I think there's a reasonable conservative position, often the position that I hold myself, and makes sort of a bastardized version of that argument, or doesn't even make an argument, actually. I mean, very rarely is Donald Trump trying to persuade, right? He's not building a case. He's making an assertion, or he's exerting power. And, one example would be the federal bureaucracy and the need to, I think, cut pretty dramatically what is a bloated federal bureaucracy that's become very unresponsive to the people who elect those who give it power. And there is a long, I think, important limited government case for really rethinking how the federal bureaucracy operates and how big it should be. I've been making that case for a long time. Donald Trump comes, and Trump and many of his allies are making a case that I think sort of sits alongside that longer conservative argument, but then sort of replaces a principled case about inefficiency of big government and the sort of tenuous ties between voters and the bureaucrats who are ultimately making, quasi-legislative decisions about how the country is going to be run. And instead, in effect says, we need to cut the bureaucracy and put all sorts of Trump people in. And you just think, well, that's not really the argument here. That's not, there's no principled case there. Then it's just like my people in power are better than their people in power. And that might be true. Some people undoubtedly would agree with that. But for me, it's about the principle of the matter and the size and scope of government, not about who's actually operating the government.
And not only that, but then it makes you look like a hack. When you make the principled argument, we need to do something about this bureaucracy. What people hear is, we need to get rid of the deep state so that Trump can do whatever he wants and he won't be held accountable. So he has ruined what actually was a defensible conservative intellectual argument. And if you make it now, it's less persuasive, less effective, and actually casts you. And I'm telling you, people will, in their ears, they will be like, oh, this guy's a Trump apologist, obviously.
Yes.
And
absolutely,
I think,
right. And
I was going to say, who knows how many issues he has destroyed over the last 7 or 8 years.
I'm totally with you. And, to go a step further following your point, it's not just the federal bureaucracy or the Trumpian arguments on that, specifically with respect to what he calls and Trump supporters call the deep state, the national security and law enforcement bureaucracy. I spent a pretty big chunk of my career reporting on the excesses of that deep state, of the national security and law enforcement bureaucracy, and spending time sort of living in the weeds, doing reporting on this, whether it was about Benghazi, whether it was about the intelligence agencies with respect to Bush policies, what have you. And I think it's true that many people in those bureaucracies are exercising power that the framers never would have imagined providing them. And if you sort of have worked in that environment for a while, many of those people are sort of ideological left-wingers. And there's a really important case to be made there about the way that part of the federal bureaucracy operates. Trump doesn't do that. I mean, I remember when he went to the CIA at the beginning of his term, it sort of blasted the intelligence community, these sweeping condemnations, usually in support of a conspiracy that is not proven and is often not true at all. And it does just make it really hard to make a fact-based, intelligent case or philosophical case when he's sort of making, in a much louder voice, obviously reaching many, many more people, a case that seems to discredit the ones that movement conservatives are making.
Yeah, I think he's discredited and delegitimized some valid points that conservatives should be making. The other thing, Steve, is I'm sure you felt the same way. I was reminded of this during the recent abortion discussion with Donald Trump. And look, I mean, I'm pro-life, but I believe in exceptions, and I also understand the practicality of politics, and you have to get elected to implement policy and all of that. But having said that, I feel like I've spent the last 7 or 8 years with people calling me a rhino and saying that Donald Trump and Carrie Lake, they fight. What
Right.
if you conserve, Matt Lewis? Nothing. What is Edmund Burke? That's a joke. But Donald Trump, he fights. And I'm like, well, not this week. Not on the abortion issue, at least. I mean, they're immediately flipped, and they're certainly Carrie Lake is making a pro-choice argument. So I don't know. I just found that a little annoying myself.
No, I mean, think about some of the other issues of the Trump presidency or the Trump post-presidency. I remember very well in the early Trump years, the debates over Obamacare and repeal and replace Obamacare. And remember, the repeal legislation passed the House of Representatives, and Donald Trump at the White House held a ceremony celebrating the end of Obamacare. I mean, the Senate hadn't even done anything yet. And there was an actual ceremony. I remember Paul Ryan and a number of other Republican House leaders spoke at the ceremony. Trump congratulated them. They congratulated Trump. I think the House leaders didn't necessarily want to do this ceremony, but Trump said he was going to hold a victory ceremony, even though the victory hadn't happened yet. I think the Marine Corps band played and celebrated. It was a mission accomplished moment. And then, of course, it didn't happen. And, I think for a lot of conservatives, they looked at Obamacare and thought, this is really a pretty dramatic federal intervention in private markets. And it's unwise for all the reasons that were debated in 2009, 2010. Well, now Trump has announced within just the past couple of weeks, he's more or less for Obamacare, and that he's just going to make it work a little better, and he can sort of tame the bureaucracy, whip the bureaucracy into shape, and get the bureaucracy to produce beautiful healthcare for all Americans. And you just think, like, the people who fought for, I think, principled and I would say justifiable reasons against Obamacare, now looking at Trump embracing it, I would think that would give people like Mike Lee or Marco Rubio who fought against Obamacare in Congress, I would think that would give them pause. But I think Trump is so powerful and has such a tight grip on the Republican Party. They're really afraid to speak out about anything, to be critical in any way.
So where are you personally in terms of dealing with the fallout of all of this? I mean, Trump came down the escalator, in 2015. So this isn't new. We've all been dealing with this, but you launched the Dispatch. It's one of my favorite sites. You're on Meet the Press basically every week on the panel. But I'm guessing when you go back to Wisconsin, you're probably more recognized for when you used to be on Fox News. We've all lost friends. I think there's been something of an identity crisis. How are you past that, or are you still personally, I feel like I'm still grappling with this, but where are you on this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it was the most challenging on a personal level for me in the sort of the early stages, when people who I had long viewed as principled or as important allies in the conservative movement just sort of one after another cast aside or threw off things that I thought we agreed on together to become closer to Trump. Some of them, many of them, said things about Trump, praised Trump in public, and we're still criticizing Trump in private. I mean, that is happening to this day. I think that's one of the most underappreciated elements of our politics in this moment right now is how many Republican elected officials, particularly in Congress, still beat the crap out of Trump if you get him in a private conversation or off the record, and then in some cases literally will go out minutes later and give a press conference praising him up and down, often on the same issues with which they've just told you he's terrible. Or the people who have sort of privately said, hey, look, thank you for speaking out against Trump and just what a threat he is to the republic, and then they go and endorse him. That happens still on a regular basis. As I say, I think that was probably more difficult for me to comprehend. It was really disorienting and suggested that I was in some ways really naive about how important it was for elected officials to remain in office. Like, I thought they came to Washington, everybody knows personal ambition, proximity to power, but I still thought most of them came to Washington to advance certain beliefs that they held, core beliefs. And it turns out very few of them actually have core beliefs. And even when they do have core beliefs, free traders can become protectionists overnight if it ingratiates them with Donald Trump. And I think that's been a challenge, an ongoing challenge.
I mean, just last week, I was off for spring break with my kids, and so I was traveling and spending time with friends, colleagues, family. And I had a few instances where people still to this day surprise me by their support of Trump. People that I thought at this point I was more simpatico with. And it just, I mean, it just honestly, it makes me sad. It's saddening, and it's disappointing. I still love them, but I'm disappointed.
Right.
And I don't know when I'm going to get past that, but
and it's hard. And you tell me if you've had the same experience. I mean, on the one hand, I can understand. I mean, as I said, there's no circumstances in which I'm ever going to support Donald Trump. And I think if you are a voter who sort of follows politics and has a full appreciation of everything that Donald Trump has done, and in particular the way that he's campaigning today. I mean, he is campaigning as a quasi-authoritarian today, and doing so in a totally unapologetic fashion. I mean, retribution is the theme of the campaign. He's basically, the campaign is, I'm going to get these bad guys. If you know all that and you're still supportive of Donald Trump, I find that very hard to understand. There are people who don't follow politics. A lot of people, most people, most voters don't follow politics anywhere as closely as you and I do. They're, raising their families, they're running a business, they're occupied with things other than politics. And they look up at the end of the day and they don't like what Joe Biden is doing, maybe in a very personal way, right? Maybe if it's somebody who's a very convicted pro-life Christian, and they say, man, I don't love what Donald Trump is doing, but I can't vote for somebody like Joe Biden, who now seems to be sort of an abortion enthusiast in a way. Remember, Joe Biden used to be pro-life. And this pro-life voter says, there's no way I can vote for Joe Biden. Or if it's somebody who's running a business and, the Biden EPA is enforcing regulations that literally could lead to the ruin of this person's business. I guess I make distinctions between those kind of voters, even if I still disagree with them at the end of the day, and I do, and the kind of super Trump and the people who are, not only on board with supporting him, but enthusiastic about the retribution arguments he's making, which are, I think, very scary.
Amazing. So I was listening to the Bulwark podcast a couple of days ago. I'm asking you this because I know you've done a lot more reporting on the Hill than I have, because I've done none. You probably know more about the Hill. Adam Kinzinger was saying, unless I'm mistaken, that one member, for example, Mike Gallagher, who is retiring, that he could force a vote on Ukraine funding if he really wanted to. Is that correct? And why is nobody doing this?
Yeah, I think it is correct. And, you could pick Mike Gallagher. There are a number of other Republicans who could serve the same function. My best understanding, and I will admit that I have not been doing a lot of sort of day-to-day reporting on the process with respect to Ukraine funding. So I cover the Hill and I talk to members of Congress pretty regularly, but I haven't been asking these specific questions. But my impression is, sort of one click removed, that they're waiting to see if the sort of sense that the majority of House Republicans still want to fund Ukraine. And you have Speaker Mike Johnson saying, in effect, like, hey, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. He said this at times in public. He's said, I think, given stronger assurances to pro-Ukraine legislators in private, and trying to give him space to operate, to hold the Republican conference together as much as possible, and to sort of advance that at an appropriate time. I do think, given the importance of Ukraine funding, at a certain point, if it becomes clear that he's not going to make that happen, or whether he doesn't have I think he does have the ability. If he doesn't have the will, I think somebody like Mike Gallagher, who's leaving Congress early, that would be a very honorable thing to do on the way out the door, is to make sure that funding continues.
But for now, you think best move is to hope that Mike, that the speaker will actually get around to this without being, like, was it a discharge petition or something?
Right. Yep. It's a discharge petition. I don't know that I would say it's the best move. I mean, for me, sort of every minute matters here. And, I've been very critical of the Biden administration for, eventually doing the right thing, dithering for days, weeks, months, and then eventually getting to the right policy, sometimes with some real costs in the on-the-ground warfighting, I think, in Ukraine. But if that applies to the Biden administration, it certainly applies more to House Republicans, who are responsible for holding this up. So I don't think I would say it's the preferable thing to do. It's just my understanding of why even some pro-Ukraine funding House Republicans are giving Johnson the room to maneuver. They understand that he's in a pickle in terms of House Freedom Caucus members, Marjorie Taylor Greene in particular, and don't want to sort of force him or force an issue without giving him the opportunity to work through it.
All right, let's move to a sort of a lightning round. And I would start with a couple of questions made famous by our mutual friend, Jamie Weinstein. Who is somebody who has impressed you with how they turned out during the Trump era? And who is somebody who has disappointed you regarding how they turned out during the Trump era?
Boy, those are great questions. And I have not had that conversation with Jamie. I mean, the obvious answer on who's impressed me would be Liz Cheney. I've known her for 25 years. I wrote a book about her father. I'm not surprised by what she's done, but I am impressed by what she's done. And you know, I know her pretty well. I talk to her pretty often. She had eyes wide open in taking all of the steps that she was taking. She understood that as she continued to criticize Donald Trump as the number 3 Republican in the House, that she would not be the number 3 Republican in the House for very long. She also understood clearly and fully that if she kept making those arguments, she would not be reelected in Wyoming, and she wasn't. And you really don't see many elected Republicans so willing to put personal ambition aside to make principled arguments in the way that she has done, I think at great cost, not just to her political future, but at great cost in other ways. So again, I'm not surprised by what she's done, but I certainly am impressed by what she's done. And disappointed, I think we first got to know each other, Matt, when we were both covering Marco Rubio. We were at some of his events, and I kind of embedded myself in his campaign in 2010 when he was first running. We drove around the state of Florida, and I think in a minivan, taking 5-6 hour drives from Coral Gables, Miami area, all the way up to North Central Florida, for him to do events. And I was so impressed with Rubio and his rhetorical abilities and the argument, in particular in the arguments he was making. I thought he was sort of a kindred spirit on limited government conservatism, but with the optimism that I think is necessary to make the kinds of arguments that limited government conservatives should be making. And he's been more or less true to at least what my perception was that he believes on national security issues. Hasn't always maybe been as forceful as I would like him to be, but on domestic policy, and in particular on sort of subservience and fealty to Trump, has just been a tremendous disappointment. And it's the kind of thing that, I don't know if you've had this experience, Matt. It makes me question my own judgment. I really thought that he was different. Like this was somebody who really believed the stuff and was really willing to make arguments. Sometimes they weren't. The arguments he was making, the free market arguments he was making in the Senate and on the campaign trail in 2016 were not necessarily sort of the obvious poll-tested, focus grouped arguments that you would make to be popular in Republican circles. And he was making them anyway. And I liked that. I really respected that. And it just makes me think that I was not as attuned to ambition in that case as I should have been.
You broke my heart, Marco. A Godfather reference for those who don't get it. But dude, your lips to God's ears. Okay, another Jamie Weinstein question. So Donald Trump, he gets elected in 2016. One of the advantages he had was that he was famous. He had been on The Apprentice. The other advantage is he staked out interesting different positions: the populism, the nationalism, the isolationism, the xenophobia. Which was it that which of the two things, and I'm sure it's a combination, but which of the two things was the most important to his success?
Yeah, this was a cop-out answer, but I strongly believe it was both. I don't think he could have done it just riding on fame. If he had basically made Jeb Bush arguments riding on Donald Trump's fame, I don't think it would have worked. At the same time, if nobody had known who he was and he was making the kinds of populist arguments he was making, I don't think it would have worked. It's no small thing that this guy hosted a television show. He was in people's living rooms week in, week out, where he was firing people who he thought was ineffective. And if you're a Republican and you're looking at Washington and you're saying, boy, I just wish somebody could go in there and clean the place out. Trump adopts this drain the swamp mantra. He's got a history of doing this, not just with average Americans and would-be entrepreneurs, but with celebrities. He was booting these people. He had the power to boot these people if they crossed him. And I think that, the audience for The Apprentice wasn't so huge that swung the election. But I think what it said about Trump, most of which I think was fake, was hugely beneficial to him. But then also his willingness, and this is a place where, I give him some credit. I disagree with him on sort of every one of these departures policy-wise, but it did take some guts for him to stand up on a stage in a Republican primary and say, yeah, you know what? I think these guys screwed up Iraq big time. And there were a lot of Republicans who thought that Republicans screwed up Iraq big time. Now, Trump would quickly run off into some conspiracy theories and make arguments that didn't really hold up. And
he also, I think he probably supported Iraq initially too, right?
He definitely did. He definitely did. I mean, all of this is bad faith, but it was effective. And I do think it was the combination of the two. And unfortunately, it leaves us with somebody, at the head of the Republican Party who doesn't believe in entitlement reform, which I think is one of the most important issues in the country today. Republicans had actually shown remarkable and rare political courage on entitlement reform and addressing debt and deficits. And Trump almost single-handedly has walked them all away, almost all of them away, with a handful of exceptions.
All right, I'll end with a question that's more forward-looking, although maybe not any more positive, depending on what you think. How does this end? Let's say that Donald Trump drops dead of a heart attack tomorrow. What happens? Can the Republican Party get past Trump? Is it a hybrid? Do we go back to Mitt Romney? What happens?
Yeah, so I think in that scenario, it's something of a mix. You will have a number of Republicans who view the path to success as an effort to be like Trump, or be like Trump without the tweets, as they would euphemize the description. And I think people could have some success on that. Would it surprise me if say, a J.D. Vance, who has some intellectual heft. I mean, I certainly disagree with the guy, and I think he's made a lot of bad faith arguments in the past 2 years. But he's smart and can make sort of some of the populist arguments, some of the populist claims that Trump makes. J.D. Vance can make them as arguments, and that's a distinction, and I think an important one. So I could see J.D. Vance, or people like J.D. Vance, emerging. Josh Hawley potentially. But I also think that with Trump gone, if he were actually gone, there are so many Republicans who are afraid of him, and make the decisions that they make because they're afraid of him. They say the things that they say because they're afraid of him. They vote the way they vote because they're afraid of him. That if he were gone, they would go back to making the arguments they made that got them elected in the first place, and that they make behind closed doors these days. I mean, does anybody really think Tim Scott is a Trump enthusiast? I don't. I've known Tim Scott for years and years. I've had conversations with him on policy.
Yeah. But what we also now know, and this goes back to the Rubio thing, is we now know that all of these people are weak as well. So even if they revert back to more sane policy and more sane rhetoric, we can't really trust them again. That's what bothers me.
Right.
Trump has destroyed the credibility of an entire generation of young Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's largely true. I try to make distinctions, and I think, Matt, we've talked about this before too. I do think that there are people who, went to work in the Trump administration, in large part because they wanted to constrain him. And so they didn't go in as Trump enthusiasts, but they went in because they were worried. They went in because they were concerned. Some of them, I think, stayed that way or left the administration. Not a lot of the sort of superstar cabinet secretary level people. Others of them went in. I think Mike Pompeo went in skeptical of Donald Trump, generally speaking, and concerned about the kinds of things that Trump was talking about doing, but left. I mean, he just endorsed Trump for 2024 a couple days ago. I think left as a convert. I give some. I can understand why some of the people who worked in the Trump administration, or somebody like Paul Ryan was Speaker of the House. He made a bunch of decisions and sometimes made arguments that I like to think I wouldn't have made, supportive of Trump. But I can understand why Paul Ryan, who was Speaker of the House, who was raising money for other House members, who had House members who were supportive of Trump, who had to advance some kind of a Republican agenda instead of just fighting Trump. I can understand why Paul Ryan made the decisions he made. And even in those places where I like to think I would have made different decisions, I get it. So I make those decisions, if that makes sense, I make those distinctions still. And so there are some people who, probably ended up closer to Trump than I would have expected or that I would have liked, but haven't, aren't sort of so tarnished that they are irredeemable. If that makes sense.
No, it's like a Dante's Inferno. There's different levels of Trumpism and a different version of hell, depending on where you come down on that. Well, I feel like this has been therapeutic for me, if nothing else, Stephen.
Very much. You know what has been fun about this is I've been so concerned with helping to build the business side of the Dispatch that I haven't been doing as much of this lately. And this has been such a great sort of journeying back into these conversations. And as I say, some of the conversations we've had over a glass of wine, having them here has been fantastic. Appreciate it.
Awesome, my friend. Well, let's get that glass of wine. I know you're a connoisseur of Spanish wine, I believe, right?
Spanish. I'm not a broad connoisseur. I love my Spanish wine for sure.
So let's make that happen. Everybody check out the Dispatch. Steve Hayes, thanks for coming back on.
Anytime. Thanks, Matt.